the Women's Business Center of North Carolina. I want to welcome everybody who's watching this. Take advantage of this presentation by Laura Jackson. We at the Business Center offer business counseling and assistance for people starting new businesses or working with their existing business, trying to get off the ground, looking for funding, looking to write a business plan. Whatever you need, we try to give you as much help as we can, and we're there for you. So enjoy the presentation, and we'll be talking again soon.
All right, thank you. Hi, I'm Lori Jackson, and I'm the president of White Raven Security. We're a woman-owned small business in Charlotte providing cybersecurity consulting services. For the past year and a half, we've been supporting clients on a variety of cybersecurity objectives, including helping businesses navigate the world of cybersecurity compliance. So by now, if you're if you work in the defense arena, you may have heard or attended a webinar on the CMMC, and you may know what it's all about. But for some, this may be relatively new. So I'm going to give you the CMMC Cliff Notes and then jump into the main topic, which is providing real actionable advice for small businesses when approaching cybersecurity compliance and developing an overall cyber program. But before we dive into the specifics, we need to understand the foundation from which all of the DoD cyber concerns and motivations lie, and that's protecting the data. If you've been on any of these webinars, you've probably heard Katie Arrington compare the F-35 to China's J-31. And if you go online and you look, the resemblance of the two aircrafts is very unnerving. Our adversaries know our weaknesses. They know how to find their way into what matters, and it's most often through the path of least resistance. And unfortunately, a lot of times that is small businesses. When the data is transmitted in the clear or stored in a Dropbox with the password 12345, it is vulnerable to compromise. The first type of data we'll be concerned about is defined in FAR 52.204-21, and that's Federal Contract Information, or FCI. This is any data that was created by or for the government, and it's not intended for public release. So at a minimum, all defense contractors will be required to adequately store and protect FCI. And this is accomplished through CMMC Level 1, which is the level that DoD anticipates 80% of companies that work for them will fall into. The other type of data that we're concerned about is controlled unclassified information, or CUI. This type of data has a higher value to the government, although it's not classified. The loss of CUI would have serious adverse effects on the mission or on national security. A common complaint that we hear is that even if a contractor is subject to the CUI-related DFARS clause, which I'm going to talk about in just a minute, the data is often not marked. So they aren't sure if the data they have is actually CUI and therefore needs more protection. And this is a problem that's been brought up many times to the DoD, and they're actively working to resolve the issue. And I have a list of resources at the end of the presentation with more information about that. So that brings us to the FAR and the DFARS that regulate this protection of the data. As I mentioned previously, the FAR 52.204-21, it outlines FCI and also the minimum safeguarding requirements to protect contracts that have that type of data in them. So this relates to data that's either stored or transmitted through the company's information systems, like their servers or their desktops, those kinds of things. These safeguards include things like escorting visitors, locking doors where the FCI is stored, running antivirus software, and several others. But all in all, the FAR 52 is considered basic cyber hygiene, which incidentally also maps well to CMMC Level 1. So now we're going to take it up a notch and talk about CUI. That was the controlled and classified information I mentioned earlier. These protections are outlined in DFARS 252.204-7012. It's a clause that you may have heard about, but among other things, this clause mandates companies comply with NIST SP 800-171. It requires the contractor to address each of the 110 security controls and document them in a system security plan. Any controls that are not being addressed are to be placed in a plan of action and milestones, which defines a timeline for compliance. Contractors are expected to self-certify that their company is in compliance. Your signature on the contract is what does that. But over time, it became apparent to the DoD with the persistent loss of data that self-certification just isn't working. So that leads us to the need for the CMMC, or the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. This model was developed by Carnegie Mellon and Johns Hopkins, and it's meant to be a verification that the DFAR 7012 was missing. In order to compete, and this is very important, a company must have the appropriate CMMC certification, depending on what the contract requires. And where the DFARS allowed you to have a plan of action for controls you haven't implemented, the CMMC doesn't allow that. You'll be required to meet all of the court requirements for a level in order to obtain the certification for that level. On this slide, you'll see how the 5 levels progress. CMMC level 1, as I mentioned previously, is considered basic cyber hygiene, and it includes all of the FAR 52 that I mentioned before. There are 17 practices in level 1. Level 2 is a transition meant to prepare a company to handle CUI. That's the controlled and classified information. Level 2 can include 17 practices from level 1 plus 55 more practices. And these practices are things like have a plan to address visitors who come into your office. How do you handle that? So each one of these practices is a different cyber activity. As the levels increase, so do the requirements, obviously. And a greater level of maturity is also expected as you go up. A company that is required to handle CUI will need to be certified at level 3 or higher, which includes all the practices in levels 1 and 2, as well as 58 more. So if you're not doing the math, I've done it for you. That's 130 practices that you'll need to perform in order to achieve a level 3 certification. If you've had a chance to read the CMMC, I'm sure that you probably realize the magnitude of all this. DoD plans to implement the CMMC using a phased rollout over the next 5 years. During the first year of the rollout, they've identified these programs on the slide to be what's called pilots. The goal is to identify a total of 15 new acquisitions in FY21, and they expect each pilot acquisition will include 100 companies. So that's a total of 1,500 companies that will need to be assessed for the CMMC on these pilot contracts. Their expectation, though, is that only 20% of these companies will need to be able to handle CUI at level 3 or higher. The cost to assess for CMMC on these pilot contracts, unfortunately, will fall on the contractor. So just because you're on a pilot contract doesn't mean you're going to be assessed for free. Now, there are a few challenges to this rollout for sure. One is the timing of the acquisitions. They don't want adding CMMC to cause a slowdown and want to ensure that they can still make these awards in 2021. And those assessments will also need to be done by certified assessors. And the CMMC ecosystem is still being stood up to accomplish that. So what do we do in the meantime? An interim rule change went into effect in December that identifies 3 new DFARS clauses. One of those was to put plans into place for implementing the CMMC, which we've been discussing. However, there are 2 new clauses related to this, and they reference the DoD assessment methodology. DCMA has been conducting these assessments for a while, and their intent is to evaluate a company's compliance with a document called NIST SP 800-171, which is much of the foundation for the CMMC. For this, the government uses NIST 800-171A, which is an assessment guide, to evaluate a contractor's system for compliance. Each control is given a score, and if it's implemented, you get 1 point, the goal being a total score of 110. Controls that are not implemented will receive a negative score. Some controls are more important than others, and they have a higher score value, in some cases up to 5. So it's conceivable for a contractor to score below 0 if they're not doing all of the controls and they lose more than 1 point. There are 3 levels of evaluation when it comes to this assessment. Each level provides an increase in confidence to the government that the contractor can be trusted to protect the data. A basic assessment would be done by the contractor, scoring themselves and providing a low level of confidence to the government. Increasing from there, a medium assessment would require the same contractor self-assessment, but it adds a verification step by the DoD. And then there's a high assessment, which takes it 1 step further with an on-site DoD confirmation that you're actually doing what you state in your self-assessment. Since it follows the NIST SP 800-171, an SSP and a POAM, or a plan of action, are allowed, giving the contractor the ability to make improvements. Now, I keep mentioning NIST SP 800-171, so just a quick overview of that document. This document, it's meant for non-federal systems, and it outlines 110 security controls that, when implemented, provide the system with increased cyber protection. The NIST requires that you create a system security plan detailing your system and how you meet each of the 110 controls. Any control that you haven't yet implemented will be placed in a plan of action and milestones with a date of anticipated completion. The goal being continuous improvement and eventual compliance with all 110 controls. This stepping stone is a good start towards compliance with CMMC. However, be aware that if you're required to handle CUI, CMMC Level 3 adds 20 additional practices and a need to demonstrate maturity. That means you'll need well-established policies, procedures, plans, budgeting, role and responsibility documents, and proof that you've been following them. That requires documentation, maintenance, and tracking capability, which follow NIST 800-171 alone will not cover. The new DFARS rule puts into place these 3 clauses. As of December, these will begin to appear in new contracts, task orders, and delivery orders. There are 3 clauses, 7019, 7020, and 7021. The gist of it is 7019 will put into place a DoD assessment that is required every 3 years for any contract to be awarded. And then 7020 allows the government to come in and verify your assessment in the medium or high, as we mentioned previously. 7020 also requires that primes begin to ensure their subcontractors are also meeting the same requirement and have their scores on file. And then, as I mentioned about the CMMC, this third one, 7021, outlines how that implementation is going to go, which is over the next 5 years. If the DFARS 252.204-7012 appears in your contracts already, the contracting officer will be required to verify your DoD assessment methodology score prior to exercising an option period or extending a period of performance or assigning a new task order under that contract. So this is a lot, and it can be quite a climb for small businesses. So I'd like to talk about some of the steps that you can take towards compliance that you can put into action right away. First of all, review your contracts. Do you have DFARS 252.204-7012 in them? And if so, you're required to be able to handle CUI. If you have that contract clause, but you don't think that you handle CUI, chances are you may see it in the future, especially if the government starts to properly label the data they want protected. If, however, you don't believe that you need CUI to complete your part of a project, Request that the program manager or the prime remove this clause and not send you CUI to begin with. Handling CUI is what elevates your need for compliance with CMMC Level 3. Next, understand the data that's flowing through your network. You can't protect what you don't know exists. So take some time to lay out what data you have, where it's stored, and understand how it flows. Remember that data is the key for the government. If you know what you have, you can put controls in place to ensure that it's protected. Just like with data, physical assets are also important to document and control. You can't protect what you don't know exists, right? You should determine all the devices that are connected to your network. Any unmanaged or unknown device could be an entry point into your system by an adversary. Also keep in mind, you can't control what you don't own. So any device that's not under your control should not contain company or government data. And that includes personal devices. As you can see, understanding what you have will put you on the right path for protecting those things. Once you know what data you have and the devices that are on your network, you can actually draw the boundaries for those things. Develop a network diagram and associate where your data is flowing through that diagram. This will help you to see if there are holes that need to be fixed, or perhaps show you where you can consolidate CUI away from the system as a whole in order to better protect it. Excuse me. Now that you have a better idea of how your system is set up, you can begin to conduct the DoD self-assessment. Determine your score. Begin to develop a system security plan and a plan of action for the controls you have not yet implemented. This will give you a roadmap towards meeting all of your cyber compliance goals. Now, cyber protections will be unique to each business and their company goals. Your risk for compromise may be different than another company of a similar size. So it's important that you identify potential threats, how they may impact your business, and think through how you may be able to remediate them. Conduct a risk assessment. Include different viewpoints because sometimes risk will look different based on the job that's being done. And finally, document, document, document. Document everything. Maturity will be built through well-established plans and the proof that you have that you do what you've written down. Maintain a repository of vendor agreements. There's no magical IT or cloud service bullet that will meet all of your compliance requirements. It's essential to know what you're responsible for compared to what your online cloud provider is responsible for. And as you assess your system, begin to develop policies and procedures that will support your goals for compliance. And don't just put them on a shelf and forget about them. Proof that you're actually implementing these policies will be required for CMMC compliance. So to wrap up, cybersecurity is not going away. If this past year has taught us anything, it's that we're more vulnerable than ever before. Our adversaries will not be kind. They won't give you a pass. Their job is to get in and take something of value. They are motivated by their own economic gains and agendas, and they are looking for the easiest path to get there. I also want you to understand that IT is a tool for cybersecurity. They are not the same thing. So handing this off to an IT department or your MSP will not provide you a complete solution. I hope I've at least shown you that there's much more of this than just flipping an IT switch. And finally, standing up a security program will not be effective without buy-in at the top. In some cases, this will require a culture shift in your company. Security needs to become everyone's responsibility. And that message needs to flow from the top. We all have a common goal. We're all in this together, and we need to approach these new cybersecurity requirements with that mindset. So lastly, I've provided a list of resources to help you down this path. There are so many moving parts that we could spend all day discussing the nuance and the what ifs, but I hope at least this information has helped you to clarify your own path in seeking cybersecurity requirements. So with that, does anyone have any questions?
I'm sure you have many questions. I have many questions. That's a lot of stuff. Obviously, this is related directly to when you have contracts with the Department of Defense or the government most of the time. I would imagine state government as well is going to kind of mimic these security measures, right?
I would imagine so. And several states are already doing that ahead of the federal government. But from what I have heard, the CMMC, the approach that the DoD is taking with this is likely to spread government-wide, not just the Department of Defense, but you're likely to see it in other areas like GSA, DHS, and other departments.
Is because the depth of the stuff that I would imagine you have to take care of in your organization, a lot of times half of this is outsourced. Like, you know, a lot of your internet needs are taken care of by cloud software, by other organizations. What do you do in those cases? I mean, I imagine most big companies are going to have their own. Basically, I'm sure they've measured up to these requirements already. Is there, like, do you ask them for something, or?
That is a really great question. And a lot of times we think if we put our data in, let's just pick on Microsoft as a for instance, we put all our data in Microsoft. Well, we trust Microsoft to do what they're supposed to do, but you don't necessarily have that verification. And a lot of what the government requires of cloud service providers is related to a program called FedRAMP. And cloud service providers that do work for the government have to meet certain security requirements in that program. And so you can't just put everything on Dropbox and expect Dropbox to handle it all. You still need to know, okay, are there security practices verified by the government through the FedRAMP program at a certain level, depending on what your contract requires? But then also, what is it that they're responsible for versus what are you responsible for? So you can't necessarily say that just because it's all residing on, you know, Microsoft servers, that Microsoft is solely responsible. Well, there's still some accountability on you for having strong passwords, requiring multi-factor authentication, having policies in place to for what data is actually being allowed to go up there and what devices it's being allowed to transmit through. So there's a lot of moving parts to this.
Yeah. I see a lot of places where you can have holes. I imagine with these assessments, that's what they're looking at, a lot of that. You said devices within your organization, actual physical things, and then the way out into the internet, and then your relationship with whoever is providing you with either storage or even just the programs you use.
Correct.
Wow.
Yeah, and you also need to think about, you know, a lot of people are working from home now, but when, you know, several folks have gone back into the office and you connect your phone to the company Wi-Fi. Does that mean that you also download data to your personal phone? You don't want to put data that you can't control onto a device that's not, you know, that's not in your control. So, you know, something that a lot of companies are going to have to look into and reconsider is, you know, whether you allow people to bring their own devices, whether you even need Wi-Fi set up. You know, a lot of times that was all the big thing, 5 or 10 years ago, setting up Wi-Fi access points so everybody could check their email anywhere in the building. But is that really necessary? Because you're also opening yourself up to another vector for someone to, you know, find their way into your network. So there's a lot of things that you have to actually start thinking about if you're going to meet these compliance requirements. But the thing is, you go through this list and you start to think about it. And if you start to make changes in order to meet these requirements, it's not just checking a box. It's actually going to protect your company and your longevity and your personnel from being exploited having your data stolen, having your customers' information stolen. So these things that we're going to be forced to look at actually are not just nuisance. They actually have a benefit to the longevity of your company and staying in business.
So you could say that even if you don't have a relationship directly with, you know, a DoD situation or secure, you really need to have these measures in place for your contract. Even without that, it's a good measure, standard measure for your security in general anyway.
Oh, absolutely.
Even for a small company.
Absolutely. And the NIST SP 800-171 was actually written for private companies as a guide to improving your security. So you don't have to necessarily, if you don't have to meet these requirements, you could still look through that document and find nuggets of information that will help you to secure your environment. It's really a good document to take a look at.
Could you repeat it again? NIST?
NIST, that's the National Institute of Standards and Technology. That's a government organization, NIST. And the document is a special publication, and they abbreviate that SP. And the number for the publication is 800-171.
Okay, all right. Are there any other resources? I think there's I can't remember what it's called, but there is a publication that the government puts out. I don't want to say who of the government, I can't remember, but they put out a publication of security threats going about, or like simple stuff like viruses or emails or phishing that's been happening lately.
Yeah, the FBI does that. They have a website that's dedicated to cyber alerts and you know what's going on out there, and they'll give you tips on how to protect yourself. So the FBI. Then you've got CISA, CISA. That's the Center for, oh, forgive me, I don't recall the acronym. Security and something, CISA. They provide the same kind of information for businesses to help them know what the threats that are out there and how to protect yourself. Several of these sites have mailing lists you can sign up for. Even NIST has alerts that you can sign up for to find out, you know, what's something that's being seen out in the world as far as malware goes, or phishing, or those kinds of things, and what to look out for. So yeah, several organizations do provide that kind of information.
I think that those are very useful. Even I've found them useful just to stay abreast of what's going around in the wild of the internet.
Yes. Yeah.
All right. Well, you said you're gonna include some information on the documents that you talked about.
Yeah, they're right here on this slide.
Okay.
The resources slide. So I talked about the CMMC. There's an assessment guide that they released just in the last few months that's definitely worth reading. It gives some practical examples of what these controls mean. And then the NIST, here's the SP 800-171. And A is the assessment guide that's directly related to 171. There's also a NIST Handbook 162 that gives you some good practical advice for each of the controls. And then there's several state level resources, whether you're in North Carolina or another state. Most states have a manufacturing extension partnership, and that helps businesses that are manufacturers to meet cybersecurity compliance challenges. And then also your PTACs are very good resources. And then North Carolina has the NC Military Business Center, which is also a good resource for helping to understand what you need to do for to meet these requirements. And then as far as CUI, you know, I mentioned that there is some challenge in identifying what data is actually controlled and unclassified and meant to be protected. And so there's a link on the slide here that will give you more of a definition of how the DoD defines CUI. And they have started to train contracting officers on properly identifying that type of information before it is put into a contract. So things I think are going to get better in that area, but it's taking a little bit of time, but there is forward progress, and hopefully keeping an eye on that site will help you to better understand what CUI is.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Lori. I think we've got
Sure.
lots to work with.
Excellent. Well, I'm glad.
Well, I appreciate you, and I hope everybody who sees this finds lots of value. I'm sure they will. Lots of good resources there. And we are the Women's Business Center of North Carolina, and we appreciate you being here with us, Lori Jackson, from White Raven Security, and hope to see you again soon.
Sounds great. Thank you.